Welcome. I'm Shanta Devarajan, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this sixth session of the Future of Development series, jointly run by the Center for Global Development and Georgetown University. And I'm particularly pleased to be moderating this session today, which is on India, but it is focused on one particular part of the Indian society, which happens to be half of Indian society, which are the women of India. And I'm very pleased to welcome our main speaker, Ashwini Deshpande. Ashwini is a professor of economics and the founding director of the Center for Economic Data and Analysis at Ashoka University. And the discussant will be Alice Evans, a senior lecturer in the social science of development at King's College, London. Both of them have done really path-breaking work in this area of women's equity and women's labor force participation in India as well as in other parts of the world. Just a little bit of the ground rules. Ashwini will speak first, and then Alice will follow with her remarks, and then we will open up for question and answer session from the audience. And if you would have some questions or some comments to make, you have three different ways of submitting your questions. One is to send an email to events@cgdev.org. The second is to tweet at cgdev #CGDtalks. Or you could submit your comments by via YouTube. Just to mention, because of our experience in previous seminars, is that please get your questions in early. What we find is that we often start out, there are very few questions, and then towards the end, the questions start flooding in, and then we're out of time. So I encourage you to send questions in even while the speakers are speaking. So let me turn now to Ashwini Deshpande to give her presentation.
Thank you very much, Shanta. I'm absolutely delighted and honored to be here speaking at this very important forum. I've watched some of your earlier videos and the talks have been fabulous. And I feel very honored to be in august company of earlier speakers. I'm also very excited to be that Alice Evans is the discussant for this talk, because she has very interesting ideas about women and work everywhere, and indeed women's lives in many different dimensions. So I'm very excited to hear her comments as well as get questions from all of you. So without further ado, let me start with my presentation. Women's outcomes and gender equity in South Asia, when you think of the region that is India, Pakistan, Nepal, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, etc., it's supposed to be this belt of classic patriarchy. So it's patriarchal, patrilocal, and patrilineal. So in some sense, it's as patriarchal as you can get anywhere else in the world. And despite the fact that there are religious differences within these countries and also across these countries, there are differences in economic structures and political regimes, there are certain common features that we find in this region. So for example, the practice of female seclusion, which again varies in its intensity and also varies in actual practice from the way in which it is prescribed. So the appearances of complete seclusion, but actually when you see the lives of women in an everyday basis, and we were just talking about this before the talk formally began, which is how women show themselves now on social media, etc. So the seclusion is also, we have to think of it as in a more nuanced manner than is commonly perceived from the outside. However, there are practices of female seclusion that run through all religions in South Asia, by the way, not just confined to Islam. There is a patrilineal form of inheritance. There are matrilineal histories to certain parts of India and to certain communities in India, but those are vanishing. even the erstwhile matrilineal communities now exhibit more and more patrilineal features of inheritance. And so indeed, that's become the norm in South Asia. There are patriarchal family norms, as perhaps is true everywhere in the world. But in South Asia, they take particular forms that are different from other parts of the world. And most importantly, there is patrilocal marriage pattern, which means that after the woman gets married, she's expected to move into the household of her husband. So the practice of a couple starting an independent family unit or an independent household is still very, is still confined to a minority. The majority of Indians today, in India, I think in South Asia, everywhere, the expectation is that the woman will move to the household of the husband. And that has important implications for features that we will examine later on. 2 years ago, we, along with a co-author of mine, Naila Kabir, and Ragi Assad, we organized big workshop at the London School of Economics, where we focused on particularly why South Asia and the Middle East and North Africa region, the MENA region, had persistently low labor force participation rates of women. And we found that these practices, in fact, are not confined only to South Asia, but MENA also has several of these features. If you look at the labor force participation rate by sex and region, this is female to male ratio of labor force participation rates. This is a graph from Our World in Data. This is 2019. And you see the light pink region, which is exactly the MENA and South Asia region. And so, this is in 2019, but even if you looked at a similar graph at an earlier point in time, you would see pretty much the same pattern. So there seems to be a problem of persistence in terms of recorded labor force participation rates in MENA and South Asia. Today, my focus is neither MENA nor South Asia broadly. It's going to be on India, but I think this context is important for us to understand and appreciate. Now, of course, there's a lot of the discussion about the Indian situation has to do with cultural norms or social norms, and to what extent might those be responsible for various outcomes that we see for gender gaps or specifically female outcomes. And so, for example, if you take a question like the proportion, what would you prefer the woman in your family to stay at home and take care of the children? Sorry that the slide has gotten a little cut off. You see South Asia as pretty high up in the proportion of men who believe this. So the idea that the man is the breadwinner and is expected to provide for the family, this is, by the way, universal, except that the intensity of this belief varies across regions. And South Asia is particularly high up there, which is not a surprise to anyone who's familiar with South Asia. Again, so yes, there are cultural norms that are distinct in South Asia compared, or the intensity. I wouldn't say that they're completely distinct, but I think the intensity of the beliefs in these kinds of cultural norms is different. But we will see in a little while that even within South Asia, there has been change compared to earlier periods. Now, zooming now into India, let's look at just one indicator, which is labor force participation rates of women, right? And this has been discussed a lot, but I think there are two issues related to female labor force participation, which are related but also distinct. And I think they need to be discussed separately. One is the persistently low level of recorded female labor force participation rates. And this, even at its highest, the numbers are varied depending on who's collecting those numbers, etc. But even at its highest, it never crossed 40%. And this persistently low level, recorded level, is at odds with a lot of priors. So, for example, just a visual look, if you travel to India and you see, you take a road trip or you go in a train, you will see women working in the fields. You see women doing different activities, but it just doesn't show up in labor force participation rates. So you really wonder what the women are doing and why is it that they're not showing up. So one issue to examine is the persistently low recorded female labor force participation rate in India that has been low since Indian independence in 1947. The other issue is that of a decline, which is really a phenomenon of the last 2 decades, roughly speaking, right? And these two things are related, but also distinct. And the explanations also have to be distinct. So when you look at, for example, the first point, which is the persistently low level of recorded female labor force participation, one issue that comes up is that India, the sort of economic activity in India, large part of it is informal and very low level subsistence kind of activity. A large part of economic activity also takes place as family enterprises. So, families own farms or orchards or livestock activity, fisheries, sort of primary level or even small level of manufacturing or artisanal activity, textiles, pottery, et cetera. All of these are family livelihood activities. This is how families earn their livelihoods. I'm not talking about salary jobs or entrepreneurs at the high level that are in the formal sector. And this is all, very, very low level, informal, low productivity activities. Now, these family enterprises run on the backs of the labor of women in these families. This is economic work. In other words, the men who work in these activities are counted as workers, but the women who work in these activities are not counted as workers. And I'm not talking about domestic chores or care responsibilities. These are plain old-fashioned economic activities that are included in the system of national accounts. But however, women are not included as workers. So for example, they cannot go and take a bank loan and say that, oh no, this is our family business and I'm a worker or I'm an owner of this family business. Their contributions are discounted by themselves. They internalize the discounting that society does or their family members do when surveyors go into their homes and say, who's working in your household? The women's names typically are never taken. So a huge part of the persistently low level is the systematic undercounting of falling between the statistical cracks of women who are actually engaged in unpaid family work. And leading feminists in India from the 1970s have consistently highlighted this problem and have actually worked with the National Sample Survey, which is a big official sampling agency, to include questions in their surveys, in their employment, unemployment surveys that will capture this work. The other, of course, is accessing work outside the home, or even if technically not outside the home, but accessing work which is not related to family enterprises. And here, my recent paper with Naila Kabir, we talk about the norms that matter, because a lot of the focus on the norm story has been on conservatism, Islam, seclusion, et cetera. But the norms, according to us, that really matter is the predominant responsibility of Indian women to get domestic chores done, which means that they either do it themselves or they have to get it done. But the predominant responsibility of reproductive labor, which includes a gamut of activities from cooking, cleaning, sweeping the floor, doing the dishes, et cetera, washing clothes, housekeeping, all of this reproductive labor is done by women, or they have to get it done. So regardless of that, regardless of whether they do it themselves or outsource it to other women, it is their responsibility to get it done. And this poses a huge constraint on women to access paid work if it was available. So in survey after survey, we find a massive unmet demand for paid work if it is compatible with domestic chores. So women say, yes, we will work if work was made available either at our homes or outside or close by, but something that we can combine with our domestic chores responsibility. And we'll come back to this point later on in the presentation. In our paper, which is based on the primary survey that we did ourselves in the eastern state of West Bengal, we actually find that women who have a history of working women in their family, so either their mothers worked outside the home or their mothers-in-law worked outside the home, they are more likely to work. So in this whole story of conservative social norms, et cetera, you do see that there is an intergenerational transmission of positive norms. So, it's not, and I think that this is something that we can hang on to, because I think this gives us a clue about how things can actually change going forward. Now, we talked about unpaid work, reproductive labor, domestic work. Here is a graph from Our World in Data for 2014, which is a comparative graph. And you see here that India and Pakistan are, there is no Pakistan in this graph, but I have another one, sorry, I uploaded the wrong one. But India and Pakistan are at the top of this chart. So women do devote 10 times as many hours to domestic chores as do men. And this is confirmed by the first national time use survey that was done in India in 2019, that there is some regional variation, et cetera, but by and large, women do a phenomenally higher amount of housework than do men. So there's extreme gender inequality within the household. Now you see Bangladesh here, that's really 1/3 of, or a little over 1/3 of the time that we see in India and Pakistan. Now, I don't know whether this is the effect of increased female labor force participation rates, but I can't help but think that it might be the case that because women went out to work, these norms changed, so that by the time you come to 2014, you'd see a much more egalitarian sharing of domestic chores in Bangladesh compared to India and Pakistan. So I don't know this data from 30 years ago, but it would not surprise me if we found that in fact the Bangladesh had had an equally inegalitarian sharing of domestic chores as India and Pakistan, because 75 years ago these three countries were the same country. So, and 75 years in the age of nations is really literally a very small amount of time. And so you would not expect Bangladesh to have drastically different norms, but norms change, right? And I think that this picture shows that norms can change. Coming back again to India, so this is data from the National Sample Survey, which is a large nationally representative and representative at the state level survey that gets carried on every 5 years. A large survey, now it's being done every quarter, looking at the employment and unemployment situation in India. And here you see the orange curve, which is the female labor force participation rates in rural areas. And this is this decline that's being discussed, right? So I think one thing we need to remember when we look at the NSS data, which is a continuing survey, is that according to NSS, the decline has been mostly rural. In urban areas also there's been a slight decline, but it's not significant. It's really the rural labor force, female labor force participation rate that's declined. And so that's something to keep in mind, because if you look at the base level, rural labor force participation rates have always been higher than urban in India. So urban labor force participation has been low and continue to be low. But see where rural was, 20 years ago, and see where it is now, right? And so starting at a much higher a base level, you see a decline. And that also should make us rethink about the role of norms, etc., because you would think that rural India has stronger traditional norms compared to urban India, but you see a different picture, contrary to sort of expected wisdom. And so this is the picture from the National Sample Survey. Now, unfortunately, the National Sample Survey is not a longitudinal data set. It's not panel data. So my PhD student, Jitendra Singh, and I started looking at a panel data set. And so this is a panel data set that's brought out by the Center for Monitoring Indian Economy. And there are 3 waves in a year. So households are surveyed every 4th month. So there are 3 times a year. So it's a high frequency, nationally representative panel data. And that has opened up huge possibilities of examining trends that with earlier data sets you could not examine. And one of the things that we noticed when we started working with this data is that and we looked at just January 2016 to December 2019 actually, and I'll explain why this graph is only up to August, is so it's 4 years of data. So basically we have 12 observations on each individual. And most of our estimates are on individuals that are observed in each of the 12 rounds. So, we take a balanced panel, but we also look at people who are observed only in a few of those rounds. And why do we stop at December 2019? Because it's pre-COVID. Why do we start at January 2016? Is because the first time they asked the question about employment status, right? And so that's what we do. Now, the CMI employment definition is much stricter than the NSS. So somebody who's likely to be employed by CMI definition is definitely going to be employed by NSS definitions. So it's a much stricter definition. And one of the things we found is that there is a pattern of repeated entry and exit into and from the labor force over this short span of 4 years. This graph is only about entry rates, but I have a similar graph about exit rates in our paper. The paper is full of many graphs. I can't unfortunately show you all the graphs for lack of time, but look at this first male, female, the first bars here, and you see this 0.78 and you see 0.7 here. So what this shows is that 78% of working women in the working age group were out of the labor force in January to April. Out of these, 9% joined the labor force in the next wave. So the orange part of the bar is entry, the entry percentages, entry rates. And the mean of this is mean of the out of labor force, because entry is defined as somebody who was out of the labor force in the previous wave and joins the labor force in the next wave. And exit is similarly defined as somebody who was in the labor force in one wave and exits in the next wave. So there's a similar chart about entry and exit as well. And so we find there are repeated entry and exit by women and men, but the entries and exits by women are more frequent than male entries and exits. And so as a result, we get this graph here, which if you focus to the bars on the right, those are for women. And you find that on average, there is 14 or 15% labor force participation rate for rural or urban women, right? That's an average over the 4 years. But 44% of women have been in the labor force at least once in 4 years, right? And we then also examine the number of times they move in and out, and I'm going to show you that in a minute. But basically, just without changing anything, sticking to the very strict CMI definition, without including the unpaid work on family enterprises, without changing anything, already you see that the labor force participation rate, the reason that it's that you see the numbers, and 44% is higher than any rate that NSS has ever got. And remember, the CMI definition is stricter than NSS. So if you look at the average rates from CMI data, they are lower than the average rates of labor force participation rates using NSS, right? So if you're getting 44% using this data set, if we had a similar data set, but we don't, from NSS, we would find a much higher level of labor force participation. So on the first question of the persistently low recorded labor force participation, there is reason to believe that there is undercounting, that it's not picking up women who actually are in the labor force, but not consistently, right? So that's one thing that we learned from these repeated. Now, so we find that women, frequently transition, and the paper has many more details on the transition. So what could these transitions mean? Is it self-reporting, which is that somebody said, oh, I'm unemployed today in this wave, and so gets counted in the labor force. In the next wave, she says, I'm not working, I'm out of the labor force, and therefore doesn't get counted in the labor force. So her employment status doesn't change. She's the same woman who's basically not working. And in one case, she gets counted, by just some fluke response she gave in the labor force, and in another wave, she doesn't get counted. And that shows up as a transition. So it's not a real transition. Well, it turns out that's not the case, because we checked, okay? Is it related to harvesting, like extra demand for female labor for agricultural work? So are there seasonal spikes and dips? So is it transitions just at the time? So they enter at the time when agriculture needs more workers, and they exit at a time when the demand for agricultural labor goes down? No, we don't find any systematic seasonal spikes and dips when we look at the monthly labor force participation rate and the transitions. Now, a big argument could be made that actually what this reflects is not that they are not able to find work, but what it reflects is the fact that they have a low attachment to the labor market. So they get sort of pushed into the labor market willy-nilly, maybe when there's, the family incomes go down, or there's greater male unemployment, but they return to their homes because that's what they would prefer doing. So they have a lower attachment to the labor market. Now, that's something worth to think about, because attachment to the women are presumed to have lower attachment to the labor market everywhere, and particularly in developing countries. So we started looking at this question a little more in detail, and we find actually that 36% of women make 2 transitions, 25% women make 3 switches over 4 years, right? And 95% women make at least 1 switch. Of course, that doesn't mean anything, because it could still mean lower attachment as opposed to an inability to find regular employment. And then we broke it down by social group categories. And so the lowest ranked caste and tribal groups in India that are called scheduled tribes and scheduled caste groups, women from these caste groups make 3 switches compared to the highest ranked upper caste groups. Now, those who are familiar with the Indian situation would know that these groups of stigmatized castes and marginalized tribes are groups that have historically always have had higher labor force participation rates compared to upper caste women, because taboos on the public visibility and mobility of women rise as you go up in the caste hierarchy. That's the nature of the caste system, because women are seen as custodians of the purity of their castes, right? And so these social groups have always had higher labor force participation rates of women. They have fewer taboos in, customary taboos. And these are also the ones that make more switches. They are also poorer, and they are also in more precarious employment. All of this put together suggests that what the transitions indicate are a fractured nature of work availability rather than women's low attachment to the labor force or any other explanations. So it's a real transition, and it's because women are looking for work, and they work when they can get work. This is just a graph of the number of transitions by social group. This is only women. And these are women that are observed in all the 12 waves. So there's upper caste, intermediate caste, other backward classes, scheduled caste and scheduled tribe. I can take details of what these groups mean in the Q&A, but basically you find that, you look at the bottom 2 panels and you find that the number of the frequency of women who make 2 or more, 3, 4, 5 transitions, in fact, going up to 6 transitions, is higher amongst the lower ranked groups compared to the higher ranked groups. So the paper has many more things, and I'm not going to be able to go into the details of that paper today because I'm not presenting that paper really. But I want to also address another sort of belief about why Indian women's labor force participation rate is declining. And there are many papers looking at the marginal effect of violence against women, right? So what is the aggregate picture? What do you see happening to the labor force participation rate as recorded incidents of violence change, right? And so what we did was we looked at the data from the National Crime Records Bureau, and we plotted that between 1998 and 2018, sorry. And we look at, plot female labor force participation rates and different, rape cases, cruelty by husbands or relatives, assault cases. On the left-hand side, you have, total female labor force participation rates, rural and urban. And on the right-hand side is just working outside the home. So not really working on family enterprises, but working outside the home. And what you see here is the period that on the left-hand side, when you find a sharp decline in the female labor force participation rates in rural areas, you do see a slight increase in the cruelty by husbands and relatives, okay? But the rape cases and the assault cases are more or less flat. And when you see a pickup in the assault cases, you see, in fact, the rate of decline starts to slow down in rural areas, and in urban areas, it starts to increase. And when you see actually the cruelty cases sort of tapering off, you see the FLFP continues to decline, right? Now, when you look at only outside the home, even that little bit of correlation that you find, and we've looked at actual numerical correlations, starts to disappear. So there is more to it. So of course, violence against women is extremely a serious matter. And yes, it happens in India, and it is not to diminish the severity and the negative adverse impact on women's lives. Of course not. But I think my only point that I'm making is that it may not be as systematically related to female labor force participation rates as we commonly believe, right? And in fact, we said, okay, forget about
5 minutes,
okay.
Ashwini. Okay.
Okay, then I'm skipping this slide because we did that globally as well, and we don't really find a correlation. And so we really, let's come to the heart of the matter, which is really jobless growth, right? And so if you look at from 1980 to 2018, the red curve is the increase in total population in working ages, just in millions, and total employment growth. And you see the huge divergence between the number of people who are entering the labor market and the number of jobs available. So really that's the issue that we need to address. And given what I said earlier about the role of domestic chores and norms inside the home, I believe that the gender parity in the world of work is unlikely to be achieved without parity in unpaid work within the domestic domain. So I think both those questions need to be taken together. What that means is that when you think of gender parity in the labor market, we have to recognize the importance of policies which reduce the burden of and redistribute responsibility for unpaid domestic work. So along with this, we of course need policies to close gender gaps in education, financial, digital inclusion, legal protection, and all of these standard policy prescriptions, of course, hold true for India as well. Now, one of the key preconditions to increasing female labor force participation rates in the world has been a decline in maternal mortality rates. And we have to note that India has done pretty well in this regard. So India has registered a decline in maternal mortality rate, but the issue that continues to be sticky in India is son preference. And the material basis for son preference is what I said before, which is the system where the woman goes to the husband's home because the son is seen as somebody who is supposed to provide old age support. And in Hindi, there's a saying called paraya dhan, which is somebody else's property. And so spending on daughters is seen as watering a neighbor's garden. And what has happened in India is as fertility rates have declined to replacement levels, and yes, they have, and there's an increasing female education, male-female gaps have significantly narrowed. In fact, there's educational hypogamy now in India as opposed to hypergamy, which used to be the case some decades ago. So paradoxically, the persistence of strong son preference and small family size and upward aspirations for upward mobility has worsened, perhaps either worsened sex selective abortions or resulted in unwanted daughters, right? So you want a son, but you end up with a daughter who you didn't really want. And so you have really, so how can this change? And I think South Korea provides us with a clue, because along with increasing female labor force participation and urbanizations, the realization came that daughters could as well provide old age support as could sons. So again, bottom line, increase female labor force participation rates. Of course, and that's the challenge in India. Is it fixed in stone? Can it never, ever change? Well, if you look at the history, you see, in fact, that increase in labor force participation rates in Europe and the US was driven by an increase in LFPRs of married women, right? And in India, marriage is seen as a big constraint, but marriage rates in India are nearly universal. And so I think that India does have the preconditions for increasing female LFPRs. We have a lower maternal mortality rate, increasing education level, lower fertility, but we need to make it happen, right? And I don't think we can wait for norms to change or people to start thinking differently first and then increase female labor force participation rate. I think we need to increase female labor force participation rate by policies, and that might lead to a change in norms. For this, it's absolutely important to focus on demand side constraints. I'll skip this slide. And I will just actually put out my bullet points already here so that Shanta knows that I'm ending, which is, first of all, better data on women's work. Secondly, also recognize constraints that prevent jobs from going to women. So employer discrimination, either overt or covert, direct or indirect. We need sensitization and stronger laws. We need to solve the transportation, sanitation, etc. bottlenecks that prevent women from accessing paid work, because all of these things are very difficult for women to deal with. at the time that you're seeing a decline in labor force participation rates, women's involvement in self-help groups has massively increased, and livelihood programs. That doesn't also again square somehow with the rising conservative social norms story to my mind. The rate of female migration for reasons other than marriage has also increased between 2001 and 2011 censuses. That again shows that women are willing to look for work, to travel. And indeed, we see in India, women traveling long distances at very hazardous and risky conditions to look for work. And to make all this happen, I think the real bottleneck in India and the real issue that we need to focus on is the poor representation of women in decision-making bodies everywhere, in government, in the private sector, in corporate decision-making bodies. So women are not involved to a very large extent about decisions that affect their lives very directly. And I think that's where we need to make a dent. And I think gender quotas is a good way to go. And I think eventually, we have the preconditions, but we need to have things that are going to make all this happen and turn the Indian labor force, or Indian women and economic work story around. Thank you very much, and sorry for exceeding the time.
Thank you very much, Ashwini. That was great. Lots of exciting ideas, and I'm sure that Alice will get us off to a good start too. So Alice, it's over to you.
Okay, thank you so much, Professor Deshpande. There are so many issues that I want to talk to you about. Let me start with a really important issue that you raised about undercounting female employment. So let's talk about the data first, and then we can get into the debate about what's driving what. So you raised a really important point. Is it just that women's work is undercounted? And I think let's distinguish between our aims. Undercounting women's work is important if you're trying to calculate their contribution to GDP. But if you're interested in understanding obstacles to gender equality, then undercounting unpaid family labor is less important, I would suggest, because it doesn't advance their status. They remain under men's authority, men organize the contracts with home-based female work, women remain at home with very few friends. Whereas the kind of work that is counted, that is stable, paid work in the public sphere, is what is absolutely crucial in driving progress towards gender equality, building friendships, developing broader social networks, amassing knowledge and ideas about the wider world, becoming more critical of patriarchal practices. And that work that is counted is relatively low in India. And I would agree with you that that is the major constraint to gender equality. Now, why is that? That is our big debate, right? So from a globally comparative perspective, like you, I would start with your first slide of patrilineal, in addition to caste and, as you say, low demand. So in your first slide, you highlight India is patrilineal. So India is now caught in a coordination failure, which I call the patrilineal trap. So in patrilineal societies, women bear sons to perpetuate their husband's lineage. And that generates a profound anxiety about women's sexuality, because the paternity of sons must never be in doubt. Any hint of sexual activity by the woman generates a profound anxiety. So the entire sense of honor and shame is bound up with policing women and maintaining sexual propriety. And despite the grinding poverty of village life, women earning wages away from the home can jeopardize people's honor and respectability. And this is which creates the coordination failure, because very few families want to be the first ones to stick their neck out and send their daughter away to the cities in a village where very few other women do it, because she might be perceived as more promiscuous. So that would dent and damage the entire family's honor, their prospects in marriage markets. So it is the unwillingness of families to deviate from this norm unilaterally that creates a negative feedback loop in which wage labor has always remained relatively exceptional for women. And this patrilineal trap, to complement your original slide on this, remains, I'm gonna shift out of that like that. This patrilineal trap is especially severe in India, I think for 4 reasons. One is the history of foreign invasions in the Northwest, where women were taken as sex slaves. 2, Muslim rule, where purdah signified status and emerging elites tried to emulate that. And 3, religious diversity. In Uttar Pradesh, historically and today, Hindus have tried to protect their women from outsiders, and we've seen that recently. And also caste. If marrying within your own jati is socially and economically imperative, there is a very strong rationale for female seclusion. And this persists today, partly because of the slow pace of India's development. Indians are still embedded in caste and kin networks, which are kept alive by the slow pace of growth. People rely on their jati networks for everything from jobs to mutual insurance, when jobs are scarce, when retail banking is underdeveloped and there's little welfare provision. And membership in those networks requires social respectability, primarily about honor and sexual propriety. So caste panchayats enforce surveillance, outmarriage remains very low in rural India, maybe only 5%. And in North India especially, female employment responds very weakly to urban demand for labor. Women stay close to their homes, only interacting with their kin, and often withdraw from the labor market altogether. So even if there are pucker roads or bus networks, women tend to issue job opportunities if their communities practice purdah, if everyone else is caught in that patrilineal trap. And surveillance is so strong in rural Bihar that girls may even relish open defecation as the way to escape the prying eyes and go off with their friends. In rural Odisha and Uttar Pradesh, as we know, women have very, very few friends, and that limits their opportunity to share ideas, critique unfairness, and build alliances outside the family. So the coordination failure of the patrilineal trap means that the poorest, lower caste families have little to lose, and they regularly sacrifice survival, social respect for survival, right? For the sake of bare bones survival. But once their families gain a little bit of wealth, rural women tend to withdraw from the labor markets because they can buy some respectability again. So that prosperity in villages actually seems to reinforce the patrilineal trap. And women's reluctance to enter the labor market may also be enforced by male backlash, worries about how men will respond, especially if men are going to seize those wages and then instigate intimate partner violence. And as you say, Professor Deshpande, female employment does rise in response to growth, as it does all over the world. But with the patrilineal trap, the economic returns must be sufficiently high to compensate for the loss of honor. So East Asia was in a similar situation to India in 1900, but female employment grew because the growth was so rapid that it compensated for the loss of honor. Whereas India has a number of economic constraints. Number one, India's industrial sector has always been smaller in the aggregate and less labor intensive than East Asia. And that has suppressed demand for low-skilled labor. Dalit women have had far fewer opportunities to escape the oppression of villages and find work in the cities. Gender wage gaps, as I'm sure you know better than me, are largest amongst the lowest caste. So the poorest, least educated women have been major victims of falling female employment. And even more important than the size of industry is the unique pace of South Asia's industrial transformation. The great majority of jobs are in the informal sector, and that has hugely adverse consequences for women. So most non-agricultural workers do not have stable salaried employment. Instead, they're employed in micro enterprises, a one-man band, or for the family farm. And that kind of work is incredibly precarious. It doesn't have job security, regular paychecks, insurance against unemployment or workplace injury. The precarity of informal employment creates powerful incentives for people in cities to rely heavily on their jati networks, and they live close to their kin for mutual insurance. So India's cities, especially the smaller ones, are rife with caste-based residential segregation. Segregation by caste is actually more widespread than segregation by socioeconomic status. So Ambedkar, as we all know, famously decried the village as a sink of localism, a den of ignorance, narrow-mindedness, and communalism. But thanks to India's pattern of economic development, those same institutions have been transported to cities. One possible explanation for some of this is protective labor legislation. That may help explain why Indian enterprises remain small and why most jobs are still informal. Because if firms don't employ more than 10 workers, they can circumvent the labor laws. They don't need to offer paid leave or pensions or health insurance, and they can terminate workers without any notice or severance pay. If firms employ less than 7 workers, they can avoid the 1926 Trade Union Act, and workers cannot form a union. So the cost of that regulation is further compounded by labor inspectors' extortionary corruption. And establishments that employ more than 10 workers have to pay an additional 35% of the wage with every additional worker. So all this increased the cost for formalization. And so employers subcontract work to home-based workers in order to artificially reduce the size of the firm and circumvent regulations. And it is that informal kind of gig work that keeps many women trapped by family surveillance and control, because we know that it's home-based workers that don't enjoy so much autonomy or mobility in the public sphere. So it's India's very nature of economic development that is reinforcing the patrilineal trap. And that patrilineal trap persists. India's slow and weak structural transformation has not changed that honor-income trade-off so much. So the economic returns to female employment remain very low while the costs to honor are high, especially given the dependence on caste networks. And people remain dependent on kin. And that perpetuates jati endogamy, social surveillance, and further. And female employment weakly responds to economic growth. Now, you raised the important point about female politicians and women's participation in the public sphere and female contributions to village assemblies, etc. Now, gender quotas, are they a good idea? Well, elsewhere in the world, there is a lot of research showing that female politicians inspire each other to become politically active, to stand for office, seeing women demonstrate their equal competence, more women rise up, they join, etc. But in India, we know from Iya's work, Lakshmi Iya's work, that a woman's electoral victory has no demonstration effect. Other parties are no more likely to field a woman candidate, and women in nearby constituencies are no more likely to stand for office. Half of Bihar's seats in village councils were reserved for women in 2006, 2011. But as we know historically, their husbands tended to contest the elections. And given prescriptions on female mobility, Indian women struggle to be electorally competitive. And they may be, if they're remaining close to the home, they may struggle to amass the networks and knowledge to challenge dominant men, and let alone to interact with unknown men and to accrue campaign funds. So South Asia's few female leaders tend to be especially privileged, members of upper caste, members of family dynasties, which buy them the name recognition. For the most part, ordinary women, politics remains out of reach, largely as a consequence of the low levels of female employment, again, relating to development. But like you, I agree that this patrilineal trap is not insurmountable. And I think if we look at the diversity of historical experience within South Asia, we see numerous ways in which it's possible to tip that honor-income trade-off in positive directions. So we look to Bangladesh. When factories opened up, parents increasingly invested in their daughters' education. They delayed marriages and supported female employment. And female employment continues to rise in Bangladesh, especially amongst graduates. And it's through that formal employment, through that stable formal employment, that women gain self-esteem and social respect. And Indian women, we also know that they seize economic opportunities when they feel safe. That is, when the costs to honor are low. So if a woman can work for a female-owned firm, she will readily accept a lower wage. If she's free from lecherous outsiders, her family doesn't need to worry about honor. And for similar reasons, we also see that female graduates are pursuing careers in IT and engineering, in telecoms, finance, hospitality, and emboldened by peers. They're capitalizing on rising demand for skilled labor in Chennai and Hyderabad. Many female graduates want to work. And I think the interesting point you raised about caste and the upper caste, you should correct me, you know the data better, but my understanding is that in cities, upper class women are actually more likely to participate in the labor force since they can find respectable work alongside upper class men. And they're exercising far greater autonomy than their grandmothers gathering as friends. You know, they're working in those respectable jobs. So I think that shows us these traditional institutions, as you say, they are not insurmountable. And they're likely to weaken with structural transformation. In large, thriving southern cities, we see less untouchability, more social mobility, and declining residential segregation. And I think that bodes well for gender equality in India. Many young, educated, and especially South Indian women want to break out of the patrilineal trap. And with safety and structural transformation, that would help them realize their ambitions.
Wow, thank you, Alice. That was inspiring and a really valuable compliment to what was an outstanding lecture by Ashwini. So let's now turn to the questions. Ashwini, do you want to say anything directly in response to Alice, or shall we take some questions and then you can?
Let's just take questions. Yeah.
Good. Okay. So we've had one question so far, and I might add to it one of my own. The question that from the audience was, how far is religion responsible for the lower labor force participation of Muslim women in India? And let me add my question, which actually, it's not that related, but let me ask it anyway, which is, I notice in your data, Ashwini, that sub-Saharan Africa was almost at the opposite end of South Asia. One of the highest labor force participation rates, one of the lowest rates of cultural norms of the male as a breadwinner. I think it was right just above the Northern European, just below the Northern European countries. And yet the per capita income of sub-Saharan Africa is roughly similar to that of South Asia. So is there something fundamentally different in sub-Saharan Africa? What's going on? And actually, this may be something for Alice as well, who's lived and worked in Zambia and other places.
Yeah, so I'm not an expert on Africa at all, so I really wouldn't know what's going on. But the only thing is, when you see women working, in other words, there are no social taboos against women working, and yet countries remain poor. It must have something to do with the kind of work that's getting done. So it's not as though there are taboos that prevent women from working relative to men, but clearly it has to do with the economic structure, something that Alice alluded to in the context of India. Now, when you look at the Hindu-Muslim gaps, actually, that's not quite the right comparison to make, because within Hindus, you have very significant differences within caste groups. So when you actually plot Hindu upper caste, Hindu scheduled caste, which is the lower, the stigmatized caste groups, the intermediate caste, and Muslims, you in fact find that Hindu upper castes have lower labor force participation rates than Muslims. So this Hindu-Muslim dichotomy, first of all, needs to be broken down. Secondly, when you run actually not just tables, but when you actually run a regression, when you control for education, location of residence, etc., and all the other factors that affect labor force participation, then just the dummy on Muslim is often not significant. So I think it's the economic situation rather than a cultural factor related to Muslims. And in fact, that's where I would take slight exception also to Alice's description of the history, because hypothetically, even if the Islam had not invaded, I mean, the caste system has pretty strong taboos of its own. You don't need to rely on an external invader story to invoke those caste. I mean, I know that in the contemporary Indian scenario, the debate has taken on a different turn, and the threat, etc., is being posed in terms of some outside religion coming in, etc., etc. But I think we need to go look at a little more of a nuanced picture. So I would urge for us to not just look at Hindu-Muslim differences, but in fact look at the caste groups within Hindus and Muslims and Christians, for that matter, that have consistently have had higher labor force female participation rates in India compared to compared to Hindus. So I would take a spectrum of social and religious categories, SRCs as you can call them, and look at differences within them rather than just do a binary between Hindu and Muslim, because it's very misleading. Because the groups within Hindus that actually have higher labor force participation rates are those that are often excluded from being counted as full Hindus in some sense. They are discriminated against. Yeah.
Alice?
Yes, I can talk about this. So I think the important distinction to make is actually not religion, but region. So there's some brilliant work comparing rates of female employment across India. There's a great subnational heterogeneity. And if you look in places like Uttar Pradesh or Rajasthan, there is much lower levels of female employment, especially, so in Rajasthan, for example, women do work in family farms, right? They're gathering hay, etc. Women are put to work, but there's very, very low female employment in Jaipur. And why is that? It's because in Jaipur means mixing with outsiders, with strangers, non-kin. Whereas if we go further south to southern cities like Mumbai, you see far higher rates of female employment. Families are much more open to women mixing in the public sphere. So across India, we see this north-south divide. It's more nuanced than that, but there are these regional differences which are much more important than religion. So in Uttar Pradesh, whether you're Hindu or Muslim, there's much lower female employment. Now, what explains this north-south divergence across India? I think one important impact is that Muslim rule was concentrated in North India. And I think that's because of two reasons I can briefly summarize. One is that India was subject to attacks for 600 years and women were taken away to Damascus as sex slaves. And so that motivated closer policing, especially in Rajasthan. And secondly, that continuation of religious diversity. If you have two patrilineal communities where they each want their women to marry in, that can motivate closer policing. So if you read, for example, newspaper cuttings, adverts, discussions from 1900, you always see the threat of this sort of Muslim bogeyman where Hindus were concerned about their women mixing with outsiders. So I think this religious diversity and that history of Muslim rule does help explain some of the north-south differences, which are important.
And do you have
Africa! I can talk about Africa too. Okay, right. Okay, now this is my special subject. Okay, so Africa, well, Africa is a vast place and we tend to see higher rates of female employment. Number one, in places where women have always been contributing to family farming. So Africa was slow to adopt agriculture. It was slow to have the Neolithic Revolution. And we also see more tuber growing societies and more swidden agriculture. So swidden agriculture is slash and burn. So Africa has relatively poor soils in some places, and to raise the pH value, they would scorch the land and then farm intensively for a couple of years in parts of Southern Africa, and then move on. So what that means is land doesn't have much value because people are going on. So land is not inherited through the male line. Instead, what you need is hands on deck, and they value wealth in people. And that raised women's status for bearing children and also for being farm workers. So parts of Africa have histories of high female participation in agriculture that creates acceptability of women's mobility in the public sphere, and also in those communities where you have where land has little value, and that's common in tuber growing societies, in also where land has little value, where there's little where the land has little value, we tend not to see social stratification. This also relates to state formation. Sorry, I will try not to go on too much, but in Africa, in tuber growing societies, there's a wonderful paper by Moab and et al. And their argument is that tubers are different from cereals in that tubers can stay in the ground all the time. So they're less easily, that surplus wealth from agriculture is less easily taxed. And so that means that it's harder to accrue that agricultural surplus to build states. And if you don't have states, there's less social stratification. So no person can compel another to work for them. So instead of buying workers or compelling them, those tuber growing societies tend to have reciprocal labor, like the Tiv, the Chimbu, Ashanti. And so where you need labor, you need women, and women move freely in the public sphere. So anyway, Africa is hugely heterogeneous. It differs from India in a number of respects, one of which is the kinds of crops they grow, but it's not a sort of geographically determinate story. Anyway, I will try to be concise and end there.
Okay, great, thanks. Actually, I can't resist. One of the comments that came in was, quote, so inspiring and bold perspectives from Alice. It is even applicable to the Africa situation. I am impressed. So we just saw that. Okay, now the questions are coming in. How do you explain women's increased labor force participation rate in Bangladesh compared to other South Asian countries? And in parentheses, I disagree that labor force participation rate necessarily empowers women, but you can leave that aside and answer the Bangladesh question.
May I take this? Oh, sorry.
No, please go ahead.
Okay, so Bangladesh has two important characteristics. Bangladesh has less endogamy. So it is less important. So the caste system is slightly weaker in Bangladesh. It has less endogamy, and so that means there's slightly weaker social policing. If it's less imperative that someone marries within your jati, then families may be much more responsive to growing opportunities. So families seize those economic opportunities because the costs on it are slightly lower. Now, the other important point is that Bangladesh has had for the past 50 years, a fairly authoritarian approach to labor. So take West Bengal. West Bengal used to have a thriving manufacturing sector, but after the left front took power from the 1970s, when there was labor agitation, that manufacturing decimated because the cost of labor exceeded production. Similarly, in the 1960s, 1970s in Kerala, the Communist Party introduced labor laws that made it that made it too costly to have biddy factories, and all the biddy factories closed in Kerala. Some of them went to Tamil Nadu instead. So by raising labor costs, by raising workers ahead of the production, firms ceased to hire women. Whereas in Bangladesh has had an authoritarian government where there has been huge labor repression. If workers go on strike, we saw December, a couple of years ago, workers protested and the police responded with water cannons and rubber bullets. So by keeping wages low, Bangladesh is globally competitive in the garment industry because wages are very low. Now, there are problems with Bangladesh's garment industry. It has not upgraded, but it specializes in very cheap production. And so that has increased demand for labor. Now, and so I would say those two things. It is being globally competitive for low-wage garment manufacturing, which is labor-intensive, that increases demand for women. So it is a slightly different honor income trade-off. The lower cost to inner, or the lower cost to honor, and the slightly higher economic returns to female employment, thanks to a thriving garment industry. Now, I don't want anyone to read this as a defense of authoritarianism or as a defense of labor repression, but that is how Bangladesh has differed from West Bengal and Uttar Pradesh, for example.
Can I just say one thing?
Yeah. No, I want to hear your view on this because I'm not sure I agree with what else.
Yeah. So I think that there are lots of things that I would take a slightly different view from Alice. So first, remember that now you have labor force participation rates of 36, 37% in Bangladesh, but we started at 3%. So to think that there were fewer restrictions on women before the whole garment industry revolution started in Bangladesh is there was the labor force participation rate in Bangladesh was lower, not only compared to India, but certainly compared to also West Bengal, with whom they share a lot of cultural affinity. And in terms of labor laws and its effects on female employment, I think the story is much more complicated. It's even more complicated. I mean, even when you look at only all employment, not just female employment, I think the results are not at all clear that India's labor laws have what has kept labor demand low. I don't think that story is at all clear. And certainly in Bangladesh, it's really the opening of the garment factories and livestock, etc., being promoted at home as economic activities. That's why you shoot up from 3% to 36%. Bengal has stayed at 16, 17, 18%. So it was higher than Bangladesh some time back, and now it's lower. So that's where the demand side, because we focus so much on cultural norms and the supply side story. So we often forget how changing things from the demand side can actually push. I agree with you about low costs of labor, that wages are low, and Bangladeshi labor is competitive in that sense. That part is correct. But I think that the movement from 3 to 36 happened after the factories opened, not the other way around.
Okay. Well, let me comment on both of your interventions there. No, this point, I think you're absolutely right. It's the demand side that's going to make a difference, and that's going to drive the shift in norms. And while there is controversy about, or there are mixed results about the role of labor regulations, I think it's fair to say that they have some effect on the weak job growth especially in manufacturing, as Alice was describing. I mean, you look at the difference between the labor regulations pertaining to the manufacturing sector and the service sector already explains quite a lot of the variation. So my question there is, and I think what I'm saying, what I'm taking away from what you said, Ashwini, and also what Alice was saying, is that we normally just look at the cost of labor regulations as one of the things that impede jobless growth, or impede job inspired growth. But it could be, from what you're saying, that this has a double whammy. That is, it not only does that, but it also actually contributes to low or weak labor force participation rates, because it's serving to keep those norms from shifting. So that we really should be taking this into account when we have these discussions, these debates about labor regulations in India. That they can, or put it another way, relaxing labor regulations, reforming labor regulations could have a double effect. First, it could stimulate employment, but it could have a bigger effect of creating this virtuous cycle of female labor force participation. Good. Yeah.
So So for example, the recent relaxation of the labor regulations in India, which already in a very informalized and precarious structure of employment, the few benefits, the few sort of support like an 8-hour workday, et cetera, even though that's been stripped away. Now, when you make the workday 12 hours or 14 hours, is it going to increase women's labor force participation or decrease it? I mean, there's no chance in hell that women can go and work in a factory, hypothetically, if transportation and everything was available, for 12 to 14 hours a day. It's impossible. So I cannot see how increasing the sort of relaxing this labor regulation is going to increase women's participation. If anything, the little bit of support and safeguards that were there at the workplace, they have been withdrawn now. And all this happened during COVID. There was no chance for anybody to say anything. It just got done on an emergency basis with very little discussion. And it would be great to see a few years down the line what it does to female labor force participation rates. And I don't know the answer, but my bet would be that they are not going to increase as a result of these relaxation of labor reforms. Sorry.
Okay, good. Alice, go ahead.
Okay, very brief. Shanta, what is the population of Bangladesh?
150 million, is it?
Yes, maybe 160. So how many people are employed in the garment industry?
Oh, it's like
4 million, 4.5.
Yeah.
So we cannot use the garment industry to explain why 36% of women are employed. The garment industry is part of it, but it's not
livestock. Livestock is the other one. The big one is a livestock.
But what I would say that we've also seen in Dhaka, etc., women thronging in Dhaka, women are in the cities. So we're absolutely correct that Bangladesh has a history of female seclusion, a history of purdah, absolutely, a history of very high rates of child marriage. But what's enormous in Bangladesh is the rapidity of social change, and it cannot be explained by the garment sector because that is too small. Women are employed in services, they're employed in urban services. And it cannot be explained by the rate of economic growth because Bangladesh's growth may be a little bit similar to India's, but it's not that much higher. So the economic returns are not higher in Bangladesh than India. So I think by eliminating those explanations, it points to slightly different supply side constraints. Now, another possibility is that there's more landlessness in Bangladesh. Maybe floods have pushed people into the cities, etc. But I don't think we can use the garment industry to explain Bangladesh's particular trajectory. We also need to explain that supply side response. But anyway, I'll pause on that.
Okay, just one, I think we have time for one more question. This is actually from my colleague, Ranil Disanaika, that it says, I'll read the whole thing. The jobless growth conundrum is interesting. A different way of looking at it might be that it redistributes labor market power towards women, because isn't it traditionally male jobs like heavy industry that are more likely to become jobless? Meanwhile, remote services might actually mean women can work more from the home. Does this point to a way for India's strong service sector to mitigate this missing female workers problem?
Yeah, I wish you were right, Ranil, but the evidence is not that. So for example, in agriculture, the technological change in agriculture has actually displaced traditionally female tasks, because agricultural work is gender segregated, in India. And so the technological change, which could actually benefit women because, it can reduce the manual labor component, et cetera, et cetera. But unfortunately, in India, it has contributed to a decline in labor force participation rates. That's one thing. The other is there's this big hope, has always been, and even COVID raised this hope that, now that people can work from home, women would just be able to work from home and be able to access opportunities. So that's where we have to go back and look at the huge inequality within the domestic sphere. So that's the point that I repeatedly am making, which is you cannot understand gender inequality in paid work without recognizing gender inequality in unpaid work at home. And the norms, I think for me, it's not Islam, it's not seclusion, it's really about the fact that you just have to get all this work done every single day and there's no respite. And in fact, during COVID, we saw realize suddenly there were all these write-ups by men recognizing for the first time, all this work gets done at home every single day, because they realized that during the lockdown. And in fact, CMI data shows that just for the 1 month of the strict lockdown, men's work at home did increase, but it's gone back. Now it's worse than the pre-pandemic level actually in India. So I think that this is a hope, and in theory it can happen, but unfortunately in India that has not happened. And technology has been actually displacing. And in this paper that with Jitendra Singh, we have the effect of demonetization, which was a big unanticipated shock. I have another paper where I've looked at COVID as an unanticipated shock. And in both of these very big shocks, we find that women lose employment disproportionately more than men. So even when you account for the pre-crisis or the pre-random change levels of employment, you see women lose. So negative shocks seem to disproportionately displace women relative to men in India.
By the way, I think they found the same thing in Bangladesh.
Is it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Alice, do you want to address?
Yes, I can make 3 points here. Okay, so unpaid work is a major constraint for mothers the world over, and it can also lead to a statistical discrimination in that employers expect women to be less reliable. But the care burden is not larger in India than it is in Bangladesh, nor is it larger where I lived in the slum of Zambia. When I lived in Zambian slums, there was a huge volume of unpaid care work, of going to get the water. We had to walk to get it. We had to walk to get firewood. There were many things we had to do in order to make a fire at home. yet still women went to the market. So even if unpaid care work is a constraint, it doesn't explain why India's rate of female labor force participation is especially low in a global level. India does not have an unusually high share of domestic drudgery from a global comparison if you compare similarly poor countries. Secondly, you raised the point, well, if traditional manufacturing declines, maybe women will benefit in other sectors. Let me make two observations. In Bangladesh and more globally, we have seen the introduction of labor-saving automation and technology. And Bangladeshi firms did this especially after Rana Plaza. What did they do? They shed low-skilled women. The garment industry in Bangladesh, actually since 2016, has seen stagnant female employment because they've been shedding female labor. Employers the world over tend to prefer men. So the reason why rapid demand for labor is so important is because that eventually those employers will run out of suitably skilled men. So if business is thriving, they want all hands on deck. They have so many contracts that they need additional workers. If there are no suitably skilled men, they eventually hire women. So that is the problem of jobless growth, is because of job queues in which women are always at the back. So it's not about which traditional sector is good for women or good for men, because men will move to whichever sector is growing and they will jump to the front of those job queues. You make a really good point also, Shanta, about labor regulation, and that's also a big issue in the Middle East. And it's because of creating these massive job queues where there's massive precarity, continued reliance on kinship, and women are at the back of those job queues.
Absolutely. Okay, I think we're we've actually run out of time. So let me thank our two speakers, Ashwini Deshpande and Alice Evans, for a fascinating discussion. It really was good. And it's nice to see some debate between the two of you as well as with the audience, because these are really important issues, and the light you have shed on them is truly valuable for all of us. So thank you both, and thank you to the audience for joining us today, and we look forward to further conversations.
Thank you, Shanta.
Thanks,
Ashwini.
Alice. Bye.
Bye.